Maya adjusted the strap of her worn-out bag as she stepped through the tall gates of the military base. The early morning air was crisp, carrying with it the sounds of boots striking the ground, loud orders echoing from across the training field, and the distant hum of vehicles moving supplies. She paused for a moment, taking in the atmosphere. For many, a military base was intimidating, filled with rules, authority, and discipline. For her, it was a new beginning, though she had no intention of letting anyone know how much this moment meant. She had struggled for months, going from one small job to another, never finding a place where she felt steady. Now, she was here as part of the cleaning staff. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was honest, and it gave her a chance to stand on her own feet again. Walking through the gates, she was aware of the looks she received. A few soldiers glanced at her curiously. Some didn't notice her at all, their focus fixed on their routines. Maya moved with quiet confidence, though she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence could sometimes be more powerful than words. Her shoes tapped lightly on the concrete as she followed the directions given to her earlier. She was supposed to report to the administration building to begin her duties. Inside, the building smelled faintly of polish and paper. Files were stacked neatly on desks, and phones rang in the distance. Officers in uniforms passed by quickly, their conversations brisk, filled with talk of schedules, drills, and assignments. Maya waited patiently near the entrance, unsure of who she was supposed to meet. She held herself straight, her eyes calm, her breathing steady. That was when Sergeant Harris appeared. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that scanned every person as if measuring their worth in a single glance. His uniform was pressed perfectly, and the badges on his chest reflected his years of service. When his gaze fell on Maya, there was no warmth in it. He studied her for only a moment before his expression settled into something dismissive, as if she was nothing more than another worker passing through. Without a word of introduction, he picked up a mop leaning against the wall and held it out to her. "You can start with the hallway," he said flatly. Maya looked at the mop, then at him. She did not flinch, nor did she hesitate. She simply reached out, took it from his hand, and gave a small nod. There was no need for words. She had accepted harder tasks before in her life, though Harris would never guess that. To him, she was only a civilian worker, and in his mind, perhaps not someone worth much of his attention. As Maya dipped the mop into the bucket and began her work, Harris stood with his arms crossed, watching. He wasn't sure why he lingered. Normally, he gave an order and moved on, but there was something about her presence that made him pause. She didn't carry herself like the others. Most new workers looked nervous, unsure of themselves, sometimes intimidated by the strict military environment. Maya, on the other hand, seemed almost too calm, as if she belonged in a place like this in some unspoken way. Her movements were steady and deliberate. She pushed the mop along the floor, rinsed it in the bucket, and repeated the process without hurry but also without laziness. There was a rhythm to her work, almost like a quiet discipline she carried within. The way she walked, the way she bent and straightened her posture, even the way she handled the mop, none of it was clumsy. Harris narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to being unsettled by something as simple as watching someone clean a floor. Yet, there it was. He had dealt with countless soldiers, workers, and officers in his years of service, but this woman didn't seem to fit into any category he knew. Maya, for her part, noticed him watching. She did not look directly at him, but she felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't new to her. People had always looked at her that way, trying to figure her out, sensing something different, though never quite knowing what it was. She had learned to live with it, even to use it to her advantage when necessary. But here, she chose silence. She had no interest in drawing attention. Her goal was simple: do her job, keep her head down, and move forward. Still, as she worked, a quiet memory rose in her mind. She thought of the many paths she had walked before reaching this base, the challenges that had shaped her, the things she had done and left behind. Life had taught her resilience. It had also taught her not to underestimate anyone, lessons that others, like Sergeant Harris, had yet to learn. Harris shifted uncomfortably, almost annoyed with himself for paying so much attention. He cleared his throat and barked out a few more instructions, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Make sure you get under the benches. And don't leave streaks," he added, as though the extra words would re-establish his authority. Maya gave another small nod, saying nothing. She continued with her task, her face composed. She had been underestimated before, and she knew it would happen again. It didn't matter. True strength, she believed, was not about announcing who you were but about knowing it within yourself. And so, with each stroke of the mop across the floor, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had already proven herself long before stepping into this building. The day stretched on, and Maya moved from one corridor to another, always steady, never rushed. Harris eventually left, though he glanced back once more before disappearing down the hall. He still couldn't place what it was about her that kept tugging at his mind. To him, she was just another worker with a mop, but something deep inside whispered otherwise. For Maya, the day was just beginning. The mop in her hand was not a burden. It was simply a tool for now, a small piece of the path she had chosen. She was content to let people see only what they wanted to see. The truth of who she was remained her own, hidden for the time being. And so, as the sun shifted higher in the sky and the hum of the bass continued around her, Maya worked quietly, blending into the background, even as the first hints of her story began to stir curiosity in the one man who had tried, unsuccessfully, to dismiss her presence. Maya's mop slid quietly over the floor, leaving behind a smooth, shining surface. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and streams of light now cut through the tall windows, catching on the polished tiles. Though she appeared absorbed in her work, her mind was calm, her senses sharp. She had always been that way, even when she was doing the simplest of tasks. It was not in her nature to do anything without focus, and though this was only cleaning, she treated it as if it mattered. From the corner of her eye, she saw Sergeant Harris still nearby. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face serious as ever. At first, she thought he might leave, but he remained, giving her the feeling that he was testing her in some way. His eyes followed her movements, and though she never met his gaze directly, she could feel his curiosity pressing against her. It wasn't hostile, not exactly. It was the kind of curiosity that comes when someone begins to realize that the picture in front of them doesn't quite match the one they had in their mind. Harris had dealt with many workers on the base before. Most were nervous, eager to please, and quick to chatter, as though talking would make their job easier or earn them favor. Maya, however, said nothing. She carried herself with such quiet composure that Harris found himself frowning. He had given her simple directions, and she had followed them without question. Yet there was something about the way she moved that felt more disciplined than any ordinary cleaner. Her steps were measured, her back straight, her eyes calm and alert. It was almost as if she belonged to the rhythm of the bass rather than being an outsider. To test her, he spoke again, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "Make sure you do that corner properly," he said sharply. "I don't want to see dirt when I walk past here again." Maya glanced at the corner, then at him, and with a small nod, she adjusted the mop to reach the exact spot. She bent low, smoothed the surface carefully, then straightened again without a word. There was no annoyance in her expression, no hesitation, and no sign that his tone had shaken her. She simply continued working, steady and precise. Harris shifted his stance. He was used to people responding with either nervous chatter or visible frustration when he gave such orders. Maya's silence and calmness unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It was almost as if she had already heard such voices before, louder and harsher than his, and had long since learned how to rise above them. Another soldier passed by and greeted Harris with a quick salute. The sergeant nodded but didn't move from his spot. His attention still lingered on Maya. Something about her carried a weight he couldn't name. It wasn't in what she said, for she said nothing. It wasn't even in what she did, for she was only mopping the floor. It was in the way she held herself, as if she carried a story no one could read unless she chose to reveal it. Maya noticed the soldiers glancing at her occasionally, but she kept her focus on her task. She didn't mind being overlooked. In fact, she preferred it. Life had taught her the value of moving quietly, of letting others underestimate her while she observed in silence. She had seen many faces like Harris before, people who judged quickly, who assumed they knew a person's worth by what was in their hands. Today, it was a mop. Tomorrow, it could be something else. But Maya knew her value was not determined by the tools she held. The hallway grew busier as the morning passed. Boots struck the ground in steady patterns, voices called out orders, and the air buzzed with activity. Yet in the middle of it all, Maya's calm rhythm remained unchanged. Her mop glided back and forth, her hands steady, her posture unshaken. It was as though she was a quiet anchor in the midst of constant movement. Harris, though, felt a growing irritation not at her, but at himself. Why was he so focused on this one worker? She had said nothing remarkable, done nothing extraordinary, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about her he didn't understand. He tried to remind himself that she was simply hired help, someone brought in to keep the base clean, nothing more. But the thought did not convince him. His instincts, trained through years of service, whispered that there was more to her story. He cleared his throat again, as though to break his own distraction. "You've done this before?" he asked suddenly, his tone less harsh than before. Maya paused for the briefest moment, then gave a calm nod. Yes. Her voice was soft, steady, and simple. It was the first word she had spoken since he handed her the mop. The sound of it was enough to make Harris pause. He had expected nervousness, maybe even eagerness to explain herself, but instead, her voice carried the ease of someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything. "Where?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. She looked at him for a moment, her gaze direct but not challenging. "Different places," she answered simply. Then she returned to her work, as if the conversation had already ended. Harris frowned. Her answer told him nothing, and yet it told him everything. He had tried to box her into something simple, but she had slipped right past the question without effort. It was a skill, he realized, to say just enough but never more. For Maya, the short exchange was nothing unusual. She had learned long ago that words could be dangerous if given too freely. Silence, however, was a shield that allowed her to keep her world intact. She had spoken only because politeness required it, and even then, she had given no more than she intended. As the hours passed, the sergeant found himself coming back to the hallway more than once. Each time, Maya was there, moving with the same calm rhythm, her work never rushed, never sloppy. Each time, he lingered longer than he planned, trying to place the feeling she stirred in him. She was just a cleaner, he reminded himself, but the thought no longer carried the certainty it once did. By afternoon, Harris was forced to admit something he rarely admitted to anyone: he was unsettled. He didn't like mysteries, especially not in his base, where everything was supposed to be clear, orderly, and under control. Yet Maya, with her quiet presence and her calm silence, had brought a kind of question into his day that he couldn't answer. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. Maya, meanwhile, continued as though nothing had changed. To her, it was simply another day, another task. The mop in her hands was ordinary, the floor beneath her feet the same as any other. Yet she knew, in the quiet part of her mind, that eyes had begun to notice her, and questions had begun to form. She wasn't worried. She had faced far greater tests than this, and she knew that in time, the truth always revealed itself whether people were ready for it or not. The day had been long, and the quiet rhythm of the base was beginning to shift as afternoon turned toward evening. Soldiers hurried through the halls, their conversations filled with updates, schedules, and assignments. Maya kept her focus on her work, her mop gliding smoothly across the floor. She had finished one hallway and moved into another, where the sunlight poured in through tall windows, filling the space with golden light. As she worked, she rolled up her sleeves slightly, trying to cool herself from the heat of the afternoon. She hadn't noticed that the fabric slipped higher than usual, revealing part of the tattoo on her arm. It wasn't large, but it was sharp and distinct, a coiled black viper, its design bold and striking against her skin. She had carried it for years, a symbol from a life she rarely spoke about. For her, it was not a decoration but a reminder of strength, discipline, and loyalty. Sergeant Harris was passing through the hallway at that very moment. He was walking quickly, carrying a file under his arm, his mind busy with tasks he needed to complete. But when his eyes fell on Maya, his steps faltered. His gaze dropped to her arm, and for a moment, he froze. The mop in her hand, the bucket by her side, all of that faded into the background. What caught his attention was the tattoo. He knew it instantly. It wasn't an ordinary design someone picked up casually. It wasn't the kind of tattoo one found in shops downtown. No, this was something different. Harris's eyes widened slightly as he took it in. The black viper coiled, ready to strike, was a mark he had heard of during his years of service. It belonged to a group that soldiers spoke of with respect, sometimes even fear. They were whispered about, known for their precision, discipline, and unmatched skill. Few had seen them in action, but their reputation lingered across every base, every unit. And here it was, inked on the arm of a woman pushing a mop in his hallway. Maya felt the weight of his stare and looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, the silence between them grew heavy. She saw the recognition in his expression, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes tried to piece together the puzzle that had suddenly fallen into his lap. She did not cover the tattoo, nor did she explain it. Instead, she lowered her gaze calmly and continued working, as though nothing had happened. Harris, however, could not let it go. His mind raced. He remembered the stories he had heard during long nights with fellow soldiers, stories of missions turned around at the last moment, of impossible challenges completed by people marked with that very same symbol. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were leaders, strategists, protectors. Some even called them legends. And now, one of them was here, dressed in plain clothes, holding a mop. Harris cleared his throat, but his usual commanding tone was gone. "That tattoo," he said slowly, almost carefully, "where did you get it?" Maya paused for the briefest second. Her hand stilled on the mop handle, and then she looked at him again, her eyes steady, unreadable. "It's mine," she said softly, her voice even, carrying no explanation. Her words gave him no answers, yet they stirred even more questions. Harris felt a strange mix of emotions: confusion, respect, even a hint of unease. He had handed her a mop this morning without thought, dismissing her as just another worker. Now, he was beginning to realize that she was someone far beyond what he had assumed. The silence stretched between them until another soldier appeared at the far end of the hall, saluting Harris and pulling him back into the rhythm of his duties. Harris responded quickly, then glanced back at Maya once more before walking away. But his mind was far from settled. He could not stop replaying the image of the tattoo in his head. For Maya, the moment was nothing surprising. She knew that the mark would eventually be noticed. It always was. The viper had a way of drawing attention, of pulling people's memories into places they did not fully understand. But she had long since accepted that part of her life. She did not hide it, and she did not explain it unless she chose to. Those who recognized it would see only what they were ready to see. As she returned to her work, her thoughts drifted briefly to the past. She remembered the day she earned the mark, the long hours of training, the discipline that tested her strength and her patience, the missions that shaped her into who she was. The Viper was not a design she had chosen lightly. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the paths she had walked. And though her present life was far quieter, the past still lived with her, coiled beneath the surface like the snake itself, waiting silently. Harris spent the rest of the day unsettled. His duties pulled him in many directions, but no matter what he was doing, his mind returned to Maya. He thought of her calm silence, her straight posture, the way she worked with quiet discipline. He realized now why it had all felt so strange. She wasn't just a cleaner. Her presence carried the weight of someone who had lived in the very heart of service and discipline. She wasn't intimidated by the base because she had once belonged to a world far greater than this. That evening, as the halls grew quiet and the noise of the day faded, Harris found himself once again passing by where she worked. She was still there, finishing her duties, her sleeves rolled up, the Viper still visible on her arm. He stopped, watching her in silence, torn between asking her more questions and respecting the barrier she had placed between herself and the world. Maya noticed him but said nothing. She finished her task, rinsed the mop, and placed it back in its place. Then she stood, calm and composed, and met his eyes with the same quiet strength as before. She did not need to speak. The tattoo had spoken for her, telling him everything and nothing all at once. Harris finally nodded, a small, almost unconscious gesture of respect. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her to the quiet of the evening. But he knew things would never be the same. The woman he had dismissed so quickly in the morning was no longer invisible to him. She was a reminder that true strength often hides in the most ordinary places, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to see it. The next morning began like any other on the base. The sky was pale blue, with thin clouds stretched across it, and the sound of morning drills echoed through the courtyard. Soldiers lined up in perfect rows, their boots striking the ground in rhythm as commands cut through the air. Maya entered the building quietly, her bag slung over her shoulder, her expression calm as always. To everyone else, she was simply the woman who cleaned the hallways. But to Sergeant Harris, who had spent a restless night thinking of her, she was no longer so simple. He had woken several times, the image of that tattoo flashing in his mind. He had asked himself if it could really be true, if someone with such a mark would be here, working quietly with a mop in hand. He had tried to convince himself that maybe it was just coincidence, a similar design, something she had chosen without understanding its weight. But deep down, he knew better. A mark like that was not chosen by accident. It was earned. It was given to those who had lived through things most people could not even imagine. When Harris walked into the hallway and saw Maya already at work, the questions rose inside him again. He hesitated before speaking, his voice lower than usual. "That tattoo, you were part of it, weren't you?" Maya glanced up briefly, her eyes calm but sharp. She did not answer right away, choosing instead to wring out the mop carefully before pushing it across the floor once more. Then, after a pause, she said softly, "You already know the answer." Her words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. She had not confirmed it directly, nor had she denied it. But her tone carried the weight of someone who didn't need to explain herself. Harris felt his chest tighten. He remembered the stories of soldiers saved at the last moment, of missions no one else could complete, of a leader whose calm under pressure inspired everyone around her. There had been rumors of her disappearance too, whispers that she had chosen to leave it all behind without explanation. Looking at Maya now, he wondered if those whispers had been about her all along. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Why, like this?" Maya straightened slowly, resting her hands on the mop handle. Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "Not every path leads forward in the same way," she said. "Sometimes, you step away to find peace. To live quietly. To just be." Her words struck him. He realized then that she wasn't hiding in shame or defeat. She was choosing this life deliberately, after having lived one that demanded more from her than most could imagine. The sergeant didn't know how to respond. He felt a sudden mix of respect and humility. The authority he carried as an officer seemed small in front of the quiet strength she radiated. For the first time in years, he found himself speechless. Later that day, Harris saw her again in the mess hall. Soldiers walked past her without notice, their conversations full of drills and assignments. She sat quietly at the edge of the room, eating her meal without hurry. Harris found himself watching her again, but this time with a different perspective. He no longer saw a cleaner. He saw someone who carried stories, sacrifices, and strength that none of them could truly measure. He walked over and sat down across from her. For a moment, he said nothing, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't you stay? People like you, they don't just disappear." Maya set down her spoon and looked at him calmly. "Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to step away," she said. "Not every battle is fought on a field. Some are fought within." Her answer was simple, but Harris felt it deeply. He realized she wasn't running from anything, she was embracing a different kind of life, one that required just as much courage as the one she had left behind. The sergeant leaned back, his mind heavy with thought. He had always believed respect was earned through rank, uniform, and years of service. But here, in front of him, was a woman who had chosen none of those displays, and yet carried a dignity that outshone them all. Over the next few days, his attitude toward her shifted completely. When he saw her in the halls, he no longer barked orders or spoke with sharpness. Instead, he nodded respectfully, acknowledging her presence in a way few others would ever understand. The soldiers around him noticed the change, puzzled but silent. Harris was not the kind of man whose behavior was questioned. If he treated her differently, they accepted it, even if they didn't know why. For Maya, nothing outwardly changed. She continued her work with the same calm rhythm, mopping floors, wiping windows, organizing spaces. But beneath the surface, she was aware of the shift in Harris's gaze. He no longer looked at her with dismissal or curiosity. He looked at her with respect. And that was enough. One evening, as the sun was setting and the halls were nearly empty, Harris found her alone, putting away her tools for the day. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For assuming. For not seeing you for who you are." Maya turned toward him, her expression soft but steady. "You saw what was in front of you," she said. "That's all anyone can do." "But I should have seen more," Harris insisted. Maya gave a small smile. "We all learn at our own pace." Her words carried no bitterness, no reproach, only calm acceptance. Harris felt a weight lift from his shoulders. In that moment, he understood that true leadership wasn't about power or control. It was about humility, about recognizing strength in others, even when it was hidden. As he left the building that night, Harris looked back once more at the quiet figure of Maya. The mop, the uniform of a worker, the silent rhythm of her days, all of it was only the surface. Beneath it was a story that would never be fully told, but one that had left its mark on him forever. The days moved forward quietly, and the rhythm of the bass remained the same. Soldiers marched across the courtyard, orders were shouted, drills continued, and paperwork filled the offices. Yet for Sergeant Harris, something within him had shifted. Every time he saw Maya, the image of the coiled black viper came back to him. It was not just the tattoo, it was the dignity she carried, the calm strength that spoke louder than any uniform or rank. He no longer looked at her as a cleaner, nor as a mystery he had to solve. He looked at her with respect, the kind that came only after seeing truth in its simplest form. Maya, as always, moved through her days without change. She cleaned the floors, polished the windows, and kept the halls in order. She didn't seek recognition, and she didn't want her past to become a story whispered around the base. She had chosen a quieter life, and she intended to keep it that way. Yet, even without speaking of it, she had left an impression on Harris and perhaps on others who noticed the way he treated her differently. The soldiers didn't know the reason, but they could see it. When Harris passed her in the hall, his voice softened. When she worked nearby, his eyes carried a quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't the kind of respect that needed to be explained, it was simply there. One afternoon, as Maya worked near the entrance of the administration building, a group of younger soldiers walked by, laughing and chatting. They didn't pay her much attention, but one of them made a careless remark about how quiet she was. Harris, who happened to be nearby, turned sharply. His gaze silenced the group instantly. They quickly moved on, leaving Maya alone once again. She glanced at Harris, and for the first time, there was the faintest flicker of amusement in her eyes. It was as if she was saying without words that she didn't need his defense, but she appreciated the silent gesture nonetheless. Later that evening, Harris found himself reflecting again. He realized that Maya had taught him something he hadn't expected to learn at this stage in his career. He had always thought authority came from rank, from the uniform, from the power to give orders. But here was someone with none of those things, and yet her presence demanded a kind of respect that could not be ignored. It was not in her words, for she spoke very little. It was not in her actions, for they were simple, ordinary tasks. It was in the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, with patience, with the knowledge of someone who had walked through fire and chosen peace instead of pride. For Harris, this realization was humbling. It made him question the way he looked at others, the way he judged too quickly, the way he believed worth could be measured by appearances. He thought back to the moment he had handed her the mop so casually, not even bothering with a proper greeting. Now, he understood how much he had been wrong. And though Maya never asked for an apology beyond the one he had already given, Harris carried the lesson within him. It would stay with him far longer than he expected. Maya, meanwhile, continued to live as she always had, quietly, steadily, with no need for acknowledgement. She didn't see herself as extraordinary, though she had once carried a title and role that others thought legendary. To her, it was simply life, a chapter she had lived fully before turning the page. The tattoo on her arm remained a reminder of that time, but she didn't wear it for attention. She wore it because it was a part of her story, one that she accepted but no longer allowed to define her present. On one particular evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with shades of orange and gold, Maya stepped outside after finishing her work. The air was cool, and the base had grown quieter as drills ended and soldiers retreated to their quarters. Harris was walking across the yard and spotted her standing near the edge of the field, looking at the horizon. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward her. "You never miss a step, do you?" he said gently, more as an observation than a question. Maya turned to him, her expression calm. "It's all about rhythm," she replied. "Once you find it, you carry it wherever you go." Harris nodded, understanding more than her words revealed. He stood beside her for a moment in silence, both of them watching the sky. For Harris, it was unusual to stand so quietly with someone. But with Maya, silence was never uncomfortable. It was steady, like the rhythm she spoke of. As the days continued, the base remained busy, but Harris found himself looking at his soldiers with new eyes. He was slower to judge, quicker to listen, more willing to notice the details others overlooked. He had Maya to thank for that. Though she had said very little, she had shown him more than words ever could. She had reminded him that greatness doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it works quietly, humbly, and leaves a mark stronger than any command shouted across a field. Maya herself remained unchanged in her routine, but she noticed the small ways the world around her responded differently. Harris no longer spoke to her with the sharpness of before. The younger soldiers watched their tone when they passed her in the halls. Even the officers who barely noticed her presence seemed to pause now and then, as though sensing there was more to her story than they could see. For Maya, that was enough. She didn't need recognition or explanation. She didn't need people to know what she had once done or who she had once been. She only needed peace, and in her quiet work, she found it. When Harris looked back later in his life, he would remember many things: missions, commands, long nights of paperwork, and endless drills. But among those memories, he would always remember the woman with the mop and the black viper tattoo. She had entered his world quietly, almost invisibly, and yet she had left an impression deeper than many who had shouted their worth. She had reminded him that respect is not something you demand with rank or position. It is something you earn by living with quiet dignity, even when no one is watching. And so, the story closed not with noise or applause but with the steady rhythm of a woman who had chosen her own path. Maya remained who she was: calm, strong, and unshaken. She did not need the world to recognize her. The tattoo on her arm spoke enough for those who understood. For everyone else, she was simply Maya, the woman who worked quietly and carried within her a strength that time could never erase.